Okay, good evening. Hello, everyone. All right. Hello and good evening. My name is Liz Zimdars. I am the head of adult services here at the library. And first, I just want to welcome everybody to our event tonight. Thank you so much for coming out to hear more about Dennis Sherborne's new book. Schenborn, sorry. Dennis Schenborn has walked in the footsteps of both Scott and Amundsen and is a recipient of the U.S. Antarctic Service Medal. He survived a winter in Antarctica, traveled by dog sled, and man-hauled sledges across the ice. His experiences include sleepless nights shivering in a tent at negative 55 degrees within sight of Scott's Cape Evans hut. During his long, cold Antarctic winter, he read several accounts of the Amundsen and Scott expeditions, but came away with more questions than answers. His novel, Heroes All, Race to the Pole, is the result of his decades-long search of expedition journals and first-person accounts to understand what happened on both of those expeditions to the pole. His book is history written in the form of an epic adventure story, and we are going to hear from the author. Let's welcome Dennis Schenborn.
Thank you. I hate using microphones, but I'm going to try to stick to the microphone because there is a recording going on. First of all, thank you, Liz, for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Middleton Library for two things. One is for hosting this event tonight, and the other is for making the event and the book possible, because the Middleton Library played a very key role in the research for the novel. In 1988, I was stumped. I was looking for an obscure reference that I found in one of the books that I read about the expeditions, and I could not find it in any libraries. Those were the days, Tyler, before the internet, so people had to get on a phone and call around to libraries to find things. And the book I was looking for was a facsimile edition of Scott's handwritten journals. And there's only about 2 copies in all of North America. The librarians here, after a long search, were able to find them in an obscure collection at the University of Minnesota. And they arranged to have all 3 volumes forwarded here so that I could get a look at them. And you'll see some of those are images from those handwritten journals tonight as well. But it would not have happened without this library doing what libraries are so good at, and that is finding information for people that are looking for it and making the connection for us, and I thank them for it. Well, 2 men raced to the pole. One of them got there first, and the other became the hero, and that's the question that I engaged in 1974 when I was in Antarctica and couldn't find answers to. The more I read, the more questions I came away with. And I want to tell you the story of how I think one man got there first, how the other one became the hero. And along the way, we'll touch on press relationships, and you'll learn about things like news spin, selective editing. I'll tell you stories about fake news. You'll see fake news, and you'll see how the legend was crafted in a very particular way on the public relations side. We'll also use images from both expeditions, and in the words of the people that were there, I think you'll get a feel for what it was like. For those of you that might buy the book, for those of you that have already read the book, you'll be able to match characters in the book with their faces on the screen. You'll be able to see what the Beardmore Glacier looks like and the barrier. I think you'll get a different feel from Antarctica, or again, you'll feel cold if you read the book, because that really is what happens there, what happens when you read the book, and probably it is the most frequent thing I hear from readers. Trust me, I know how you feel. Sometimes I don't know how these things work, so bear with me. Let me begin by talking a little bit about Antarctica. Before airplanes, the only way you could get there was to travel by boat 2,000 miles south from New Zealand into this part of Antarctica, then cross something called the barrier, get up through the mountains by climbing a glacier up to an altitude of, say, 10,000 feet, and then walk to the pole, and then come all the way back, provided Antarctica did not kill you in the meantime. The first person to really try to do that was James Clerk Ross in 1840, an English sea captain who sailed south from New Zealand, right along here, came into this sea, which he named after himself, discovered Ross Island, which he named after himself, and then cruised for 400 miles along the barrier, which we have now named the Ross Ice Shelf in his honor. When he was there, he said, well, you might as well try to sail through the cliffs of Dover. The Ross Ice Shelf is big like everything else in Antarctica. It's about the size of Spain, average thickness of 1,100 feet of ice, and the cliffs can be anywhere up to 200 feet above the water. But on top, it's flat. And when Ross saw it from a distance, he thought, well, maybe you can walk across it if you could get up it. And maybe you could get to the pole that way, or at least you could approach the pole. Ross Island became the focus of early expeditions to Antarctica to try to grab the pole. It is still where the main U.S. base is located in Antarctica. It's called McMurdo Base, or the base at McMurdo Sound on Ross Island. And this is Mount Erebus, one of 2 active volcanoes in Antarctica. And there were 3 British expeditions in the early part of the last century. Scott goes down in 1901. With him is his second in command, a guy named Shackleton, who winds up going back to Antarctica a few more times. And they sailed south to Ross Island. Shackleton would come back in 1907, and Scott would be back again in 1909, 1910 to try to get to the pole. Well, this is Ross Island. This is usually all sea ice, except for a couple of weeks at the end of summer when you can actually sail in there. Sea ice might be anywhere from 6 to 18 feet thick. The barrier begins here, and that's the thing that's up to 1,100 feet on average, and you don't sail through that because it is like the cliffs of Dover. This is Scott, and at Hut Point, he built the hut and the ship, which is named the Discovery. I'm going to move this around just a little bit. The modern station of McMurdo Research is in the background there. I took that picture of the hut in 1974, and at that time you could still get in the hut. There are artifacts there. The ship Discovery is in a marine museum in Dundee, Scotland. If anyone travels to Scotland, it's something worth visiting. My wife and I were actually able to get on the Discovery as it was being refurbished to become a museum piece, and it really is quite a ship. Well, in 1901, on his first expedition, Scott, Shackleton, and Dr. Wilson, who was a good friend of Scott, became the first 3 people to walk on the barrier. And they took off from Ross Island, and they got within about 500 miles of the pole. And by that time, they had used up half of their rations. And Scott argued that they should go on half rations and go for at least another week further south. So they did that on half rations, and they began to develop symptoms of scurvy. And it was noted in all 3 of them. Each of their journals note that they had scurvy, but it seemed to affect Shackleton worse. And so on the last day of the extended half rations walk to the south, Scott said, Shackleton, why don't you stay in the tent? And Wilson and I are going to take a little walk. So Scott and Wilson walked another mile further south, and they grabbed the title of having the furthest south. Shackleton couldn't claim it because he was ordered to stay back in camp. Scott also wrote in his journal at that time that, oh my, what we could have accomplished had we not gotten sick. Well, remember, they'd been on half rations for a week, and they'd gone a week further than they had rations for to begin with. Later on, he wrote that Shackleton, how near he is to total collapse. And this hung over Shackleton like an albatross, and he didn't like it very much. So Shackleton developed his own expedition in 1907 and went back again. This time, he's able to get on the barrier, blow past Wilson and Scott's record. He discovers the Beardmore Glacier, ascends it from the barrier up to about 10,000 feet, and gets to within 97 miles of the pole. He's running out of supplies. They turn around and they get back just in the nick of time. They're not doing well either. But Scott wrote to Shackleton before he went down and said, basically, the Ross Sea is mine, and anybody who knows anything about exploration knows it's mine. You can't use it. And Shackleton said, okay, we won't land on Ross Island. He tried landing somewhere else. They couldn't find another place to land, so he went to Ross Island, and Scott was livid. Scott develops his own expedition in 1909 and quite brazenly says, it belongs to an Englishman. and only an Englishman should get it. And the main object of this expedition is to get the South Pole. Well, in 1909, there's another thing that happens on the opposite end of the world, and that is two Americans, Robert Peary and Fred Cook, both claimed the North Pole. Cook got back first. He's first in the newspaper, and he's getting the limelight. Peary comes in a few weeks later, and he says, no, Cook didn't get there, I got there. And they start arguing about their navigation records. Cook is backed by the New York Post, and Peary is backed by the National Geographic Society and the New York Times. And this winds up in a big argument, which gets resolved on the floor of the US Congress, where Congress decides that Peary got the North Pole and Cook didn't. But there's some lessons that fall out of this for the people going south, and that is get your news back first, have a good news reporter behind you, or system, or syndicate, and have great navigation records, or there's going to be a controversy. That lesson is learned by both Scott and Shackleton, though in somewhat different ways. Amundsen had been going to the North Pole, and he had organized an expedition to do that and raised funds, but now he's found out the North Pole's been claimed and given to Peary. So he turned around and went south. He sent a telegram to Scott. Scott was at that time in Australia raising funds to try to pay off the expedition's debt. And the telegram said, beg leave to inform Fram, and that is Amundsen's ship, proceeding to Antarctica. And that's all Scott knows. But he knows it's a race, probably. He just doesn't know where Amundsen's going to really land. So Scott went south again, back to Ross Island. He tried to land at Hut Point, but the sea ice won't let him get that far, so he puts this hut at Cape Evans, which is about 18 miles away. And there's three things I'll point out about the photograph, and these photographs all come from the citations that you see at the Scott Polar Research Institute. Three things I'll point out. First, all of their supplies are outside the hut, which means every time they need something, somebody's got to go outside, dig through the snow, try to find it, and then drag it back into the hut. They're using ponies just as Shackleton used when he got within 97 miles of the pole. Ponies were an innovation that Shackleton brought in, and specifically, Scott wanted white ponies because the last pony to drop dead on Shackleton's expedition happened to be white. So Scott sent his brother-in-law and a guy who knew how to run dog teams to Siberia to get ponies. Neither of them knew anything about ponies. And Scott's brother-in-law was given strict instructions, pay no more than this amount for each pony. So they went to the pony market and they had a translator who would help them with the ponies, a guy named Dmitri. And they said, we want only white ponies. And there weren't many white ponies in the market. And so horse dealers went and rounded up what they could. And these are old, decrepit, anything they can unload on the English. And Dmitri later told somebody at Cape Evans later in the expedition that when they bought the horses, he said, yeah, pony dealer has big smiles when Englishmen buy ponies. The third thing I'll point out is this guy, and that's Herbert Ponting, whose job in the first year of the expedition is official photographer. He's there to take still photographs, and some of the first movies. He's got a black and white hand-cranked movie camera. And his job is to take pictures during the first year. When the resupply ship comes back the following summer, because it's a multi-year expedition, he will get on the ship, go back to London, and start giving presentations in order to help pay the debts of the expedition. This is what the hut looked like in the mid-70s, and you can still find things on the inside there that weren't entirely used up during their expedition years. Well, these are most of Scott's 31 men. Scott is in the middle. For those of you that have read the book or are interested in Antarctic history, one of the unsung heroes of Antarctica is in the lower right, and that is Tom Crean, an Irishman, and he plays a prominent role in Scott's expedition. He also plays a prominent role a little later in time, and those of you that read the book will know about that. So the stage is set for the race. Scott is here, and he's got a mapped route to within 97 miles of the pole. Amundsen is here, and he's found a way up onto the barrier, but Scott doesn't know he's there. Another part of Scott's expedition was to take the ship along the edge of the ice barrier, and it's about 400 miles from here to here, and land 6 more men there. For those of you that read the book, that was Campbell's group. They were supposed to land there, build a hut, and explore this unexplored area because there isn't much new geography that Scott can discover because he sticks to Shackleton's route. So Scott sent the ship, and lo and behold, at the Bay of Whales, there are the Norwegians. And the English went up on the barrier where Shackleton's hut, Amundsen's hut was. And it's near a seal colony, so they've got plenty of fresh meat for the dogs and the men. And the tents are dug down into the snow, and Amundsen's 110 dogs at the time are living in those tents. The men are cozy inside the hut. These are Amundsen's 9 men. This is Amundsen. And the British were impressed that the men are really industrious. They seem to know what they're doing. They have vast experience in the Arctic. They've been to Greenland. They've got great furs. They know how to ski. They know how to run dogs. And they've got an operation that works really well. A story I'll tell, because it's kind of interesting. If you notice the profile on Amundsen, he's really pretty striking. And when he was in the north, living with the Inuit Eskimos, they do not like to be called Eskimos, they like to be called Inuit. Living with the Inuit and learning how to ski and learning how to work with dogs and which furs to take for sleeping bags and how to make sure you pick furs that don't accumulate frost, they called him Amundsen. And for like 3 months, they kept calling him Amundsen. So Amundsen thought, well, they just can't say Amundsen. Well, one of the Inuit, after he'd gained their trust, pulled him aside and said, you know, we really can say Amundsen. We just don't call you that. We call you Amundsen because you got a big nose. This is the floor plan of Amundsen's hut. The rest of what you see here are workshops, storage areas, and tunnels that they dug underneath the snow. They're well ventilated, they're illuminated, and they're kept just below freezing. They could do virtually all of their work without going outside except to feed the dogs all winter long. The Fram, Amundsen's ship, is in a museum called the Fram Museum in Oslo, Norway. If you ever get to Scandinavia, please do stop by there. Not only is the Fram there, but there's also a lot of other artifacts as well. This is a photo that some people I know took. It's my daughter. I haven't been there yet. If we compare the two expeditions, Amundsen's got 9 picked men. Scott's got 31. Scott has a map to within 97 miles of the pole. He will take 2 navigators to the pole with him. Amundsen will take 4. They both learned from the Perry and Cook experiences. But it is Scott's advantage in public relations. He's backed by the Royal Geographical Society. He's backed by the British government. He has corporate sponsors. He's made broad public appeals. He's gone to grade schools and said, children, donate your pence towards a dog, towards a pony, towards a sled, towards a sleeping bag or a tent. And he's backed by something called the Central News Syndicate, one of the early news syndicates in the world. And all members of his expedition have been required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They called it a contract, but it's a non-disclosure agreement. Amundsen's backed by his brother, Leon, in Norway. And he's got one small contract with a Norwegian newspaper to cover his stories, and that's it. Some other differences in the expeditions. The Norwegians know what they're doing. They have selected furs. They're dressed from head to toe in furs. The British are dressed in canvas and wool and Burberry. The British have fur boots that fit over their leather shoes, and they have fur mittens, but they don't even have hoods. Remember, this is Scott's 2nd time in Antarctica. They haven't bothered to learn from people that know what they're doing in polar climates. The Norwegians cannot figure out why the English can't work with dogs. It just astounds them that they would not work with dogs. Oates, or Captain Oates, is a cavalry officer. He was brought on Scott's expedition to manage the horses. But he wasn't allowed to go to Manchuria to pick out the horses because Scott was cutting expenses. When Oates found the horses in quarantine in New Zealand, he went down the row and said, aged, wind-sucking, lost its wind, it's got bad hooves. Every one of them had a problem because the pony dealer in Manchuria had big smiles. Scott takes 3 motor sledges. The first one breaks through the ice as it's being unloaded from the ship. The other 2 they send out on the barrier to help lay depots. The first one got 25 miles before it broke. The next one did better. It got 30 miles before it broke. And then the 4 men who were assigned to them had to load 1 sled and start pulling it themselves. Scott believes you can do no better than pulling a sled with men. And this is Scott, Wilson, and this is Bowers at the back. I don't know who the 3rd man is. And they would cross the snow that way. Well, the key success to getting to the South Pole, because you cannot carry enough supplies to take you there and back, is to lay depots on the barrier in your first year and then use those to resupply during your second year when you actually go to the pole. In that first year, Amundsen puts out 3 depots. Scott puts out 1. Amundsen's depots stretch 150 miles further than Scott's. He's got a big advantage to start with. He has another advantage. Amundsen has more than 3 tons of supplies pre-positioned on the barrier. Scott has less than 1, even though he names it 1-ton depot. And in Scott's depot, all pony food. No fuel, no food for men. On his first expedition, Scott wrote, trying to find a depot is really hard. It's like a very small spot in a big ocean because it's only marked by 1 flag. If the flag blows over or if the snow's blowing, it's really hard to find. Well, somebody who learned the lesson that Scott should have learned in 1901 was Amundsen. He said, we're going to put out 20 flags. We're going to build a target at each depot that's 6 miles wide. I'll send skiers 3 miles east, 3 miles west. We'll put out 20 flags. All the flags are numbered. If we find any flag, we know from its number whether we should go east or we should go west and how far we should go to get to the depot. No surprises. Scott wanted to put 1-ton depot at 80 degrees south. He drops it 30 miles short of that because the ponies he was using were dying in the snows. Of the 8 ponies that he takes on the depot trip, 6 die. As they were failing, Oates argued we should push them because they're not going to make it back to Cape Evans. And Scott said, no, as a Christian gentleman, I'm not going to be cruel to animals. We'll drop the depot 30 miles short of where I had planned. And that's what they do. When they come back from the depot trip, Terra Nova, Scott's ship, has already been to the Bay of Whales and discovered Amundsen. And so they left a note for Scott saying, hey, guess what? We found Amundsen. Well, when Scott found the note and read it, he became livid. Other men who were there in their journals report that Scott went off on a 90-minute tirade, calling Amundsen every name in the book, threatening to get on his ship, go to the Bay of Whales, and, quote, have it out with that goddamn Norwegian. If you thought Scott was mad because Shackleton went to Scott's stomping ground to get the pole, imagine how he felt about the Norwegians. This is Scott's journal entry. He wrote it later that night. And a couple things I'll point out about it. It's about codes of honor. And Scott felt he was wronged. At the end, he writes, but the wiser course for us is to proceed exactly as if this has not happened. He's not going to change his plan. Remember that because it comes into play later in the story in a couple of different ways. This is Oates, and Oates said something quite different. He said, Amundsen's just being really smart, and we haven't been. If we fail, we're going to look stupid. Winter comes, and the work starts at Framheim, where Amundsen is. They found that they had built their sleds to basically survive conditions that they read in the journals of Shackleton and earlier from Scott. And they had overbuilt everything based on their experience on the barrier. So what they did was to rework all of their equipment, beginning with the sleds. They took hand planes in one of their under snow workshops and planed off the wood from the sleds and the packing crates to make them lighter. They made them a lot lighter. They reworked all of their pieces of equipment and saved about 110 pounds per sled, which they replaced with more food and more fuel. Scott retreated to a private office in the hut to write his detailed plan for getting to the pole and wrote, every detail of our food, supplies, clothing, and depots worked out to perfection. This phrase will come back a little bit later, so remember it. In the back are pictures. This is Kathleen Scott, Scott's wife, and his young son, Peter. Peter's godfather is J.M. Barrie, the playwright. Anybody know what J.M. Barrie wrote? He wrote Peter Pan. They were good friends. Something else that Scott did during the winter when he had drafted his plan was to share it with others. And Cherry Gerard was a 21-year-old on Scott's expedition, and Cherry had the task of writing up meeting minutes. He would type them up. This is their meeting minutes from that meeting, and it's quite clear. Three things jump out at me. The first is it's based on Shackleton's experience. How far did Shackleton go? When did Shackleton leave? How many people did he have? How fast did he go each day? It's clear from this section that they know what the weather is in February. It's going to be very cold, and it's going to be even colder in March. They also know that even in February, a party out on the barrier can be held up for days by bad weather. That's what Antarctica does. That's what Antarctica is, and Scott is clearly aware of that. Something else that Scott's group did during the winter, Dr. Wilson in the middle, he was interested in studying the early embryology of emperor penguins, the three guys on the right. And emperor penguins lay their eggs in the middle of winter, and the only way you can study their early embryology then is in the middle of winter to leave Cape Evans, go around the south side of Ross Island up to Cape Crozier, which is the only known emperor penguin rookery at the time, and then make it back. It's 70 miles one way, 70 miles the other. They take 35 days to do it. Temperatures are down to about 35 below zero most of the time, but on many days it's as cold as minus 70. Well, Herbert Ponting, the photographer, took their portraits, their photographs as they were leaving, and this is Wilson and Cherry Gerard. So this is Wilson moments before they left. This is Wilson moments after he came back, and Cherry Gerard just after he came back. Ponting would write, "Their looks haunted me for days. We had to carefully excavate them from their clothing. Their clothing was so frozen up with ice that some of the scientists at Cape Evans actually took Cherry Gerard's clothing and weighed them, and he had gained 25 pounds of ice in his clothing. His sleeping bag weighed about 30 pounds more than when he had left. Norwegians didn't have that problem. Their furs, they could knock the frost off and it didn't accumulate. Same thing with their sleeping bags. Well, summer comes and it's time to race for the pole. Amundsen leaves on October 20th. 5 men, 52 dogs, and off they go. If you read accounts of the Amundsen and Scott expeditions, you'll often read that the reason Amundsen got there first is he left a month earlier. Not quite true. He left on the 20th. Scott's cavalcade to the pole begins to leave 4 days later. That's when the motor sledges are launched. November 1st, the pony teams leave, and then on November 5th, the dog teams leave. 16 men, 2 motor sledges, 10 ponies, and 14 dogs in all. Now, why do the dog teams go last? Because Scott knows they go faster than anything else he has. What are they carrying? Food for the ponies. About 5 or 6 weeks after Amundsen left, he's already found a new way across the barrier. He's discovered several mountain ranges, named countless peaks. He discovered the Axel Heiberg Glacier and goes from an elevation about 600 feet on the barrier all the way up to 9,800 feet in 35 miles. It's a very steep glacier. And he's 180 miles from the pole. So where's Scott at this time? Well, Scott is barely off the barrier. He's at 1,200 feet. The temperatures are 23 above zero to 35 degrees above zero, and it's been snowing. His men argued we should push on. He said, no, I don't want to push on in the wet snow. We're going to sit here. So they did for 3 days. These are 3 different journal entries from 3 different men. On the bottom, Bowers, Lieutenant Bowers, is the logistical wizard and Scott's best navigator. And he writes, well, delay means we might be a little short on rations on the way back. Silas Wright is a geophysicist and geologist, and he notes that they're already eating food that they should be eating 2 weeks later. Scott writes, we've already started on our summit rations. What does it mean? He's short of supplies, and they're 480 miles from the pole. They're in trouble already. About this time, we begin to see entries in Scott's journal that really tear down Lieutenant Evans. And these are edited out of the published versions, and there's whole chunks that are missing. He's not satisfied with Evans. He's blaming Evans for all kinds of things, calls him all kinds of names, and says he's got a lack of judgment. This is all edited out of the published versions and replaced with the phrase, "their ski shoes are out of trim." When I read that in the published versions, I wondered, what in heck do they mean by that? And so it became one of the things that led me to look for Scott's handwritten journals to see what was really going on. 3 days after Scott writes that, Amundsen's already got the pole. They were there over a period of 3 days. They took navigational sightings over a 24-hour period. This is actually the flag that they flew at the South Pole. They all signed it and they brought it back. It's now in the Fram Museum. And he writes, "Thank God, we arrived." At the pole in that tent, he left a note for Scott asking him to take a letter to the King of Norway saying, "Here is a record of our discoveries, just in case Amundsen didn't make it back." It was one of 2 such letters that Amundsen left along his route to ensure that he got priority for the pole. So where's Scott at this time? Scott is now only 400 miles from the pole. The ponies are dead. His dog teams have been sent back after he took them 2 weeks further than his plan called for. 2 dog teams, 14 dogs, 2 men, 2 weeks longer than planned. It takes them 3 weeks longer than planned to get back. All of that using resources that might have otherwise been used by other men. This is from a newspaper of the time, and it's obviously an illustration. Imagine that you're at the lower right looking up the glacier with the South Pole up here. They take a little over 2 weeks to get from the bottom up to the top edge of the glacier, where Scott will send the first team of 4 men back. Those are led by Dr. Atkinson with 3 other men. And along with them will go newspaper reports that Scott has been writing in his tent to go back to get the ships so that he can keep the newspaper informed. After that date, things become really strange in his journal. He begins really hammering on Lieutenant Evans, who's his second in command, and the 3 people who are with him. On New Year's Eve, Scott says to them, "Leave your skis behind." Even though they're wading through or skiing across deep snow, Scott tells Evans's crew, "Depot your skis here, you're going on foot." On the first, he says, "We rapidly gained on the foot haulers." He'd sent them out a half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour before Scott's team of 4 would put on their skis and glide across the surface of the snow, catching up with them. "It's been a plod for the foot people and a pretty easy go for us today." Then on the third, we've got another off-the-cuff precipitous decision. Scott announces that he's going to reorganize his 2 parties. Everything in his expeditions has been organized around units of 4. 4 people to a tent, 4 men to a sled. All the food and fuel is packed in units of 4. But now he decides to move Lieutenant Bowers from Evans's team to his own. Lieutenant Bowers is his best navigator. So 5 men will now go off to the pole. And Lieutenant Evans, with 2 others, one named Lashley, one named Green, will leave. They're 150 miles from the pole and have to head back by themselves. So 4 men are pulling on skis. One is wading in the snow as they head off. And he's racing not to beat Amundsen, because he doesn't know Amundsen yet. He's racing to beat Shackleton. Scott believed the only way to get up on the plateau and to the pole was to go up the Beardmore Glacier, where Scott is. And he had seen no signs of Amundsen. So he's feeling pretty good at this time. On the 5th of January, he realizes another mistake, and that is now with 5, he's burning more fuel than he's got, about a half an hour's worth a day. And then on the 9th, he exceeds Shackleton's record by 2 whole miles, and he writes in big letters, "Record," beyond the record of Shackleton's exaggerated walk. And exaggerated is edited out of the published journals. The temperature is -4. When Shackleton was at the same place, it was -40 with 80-mile-an-hour winds. And Shackleton had been pinned in his tent for 60 hours. And he said, "We've got to turn back, because it's better to be a live donkey than a dead lion." And those of you that have read the book will remember that phrase. This is where it comes from. In contrast, when Amundsen got to 97 miles of the pole, he stopped, and he and his men held a ceremony acknowledging Shackleton's accomplishment. A little different attitude. On the 16th of January, the worst thing happens to Scott. They found a single bamboo pole painted black in the snow with a black flag on the top, the first marker that Amundsen had beaten them. They got to the pole the next day, but under very different circumstances than they had planned. And this is his original journal entry from that date. You can see how worn they are on their faces. The camera was set up on their sled, and Bowers used a rope, a line, to trip the shutter. Great God, this is an awful place. But then he writes something else. He writes, now for the run home in a desperate struggle to get the news through first. I wonder if we can do it. In all of the edited versions of Scott's journal, this passage reads, and now for the run home in a desperate struggle, period. I wonder if we can do it. Kind of changes the tone, doesn't it? Scott believes still, even though he knows he's a month behind Amundsen, if we hurry, if we catch up with him, Scott knows two things. He knows that the Fram is a very slow sailing ship, and Terra Nova, Scott's ship, sails faster. Scott also knows that New Zealand is really close, 2,000 miles relatively, and he can go back to New Zealand and take the news back first. He knows that if Amundsen goes to New Zealand, the news is going to be delayed because they have control of the telegraph systems and the news coming out of New Zealand. So he believes Amundsen's going to have to sail a whole lot further to get his news through. But Amundsen knows something Scott doesn't. Amundsen knows that he's welcome in Australia, and he knows he's welcome in Tasmania. And he also knows that within the last few months, a telegraph line has been installed that goes from Australia to Tasmania. And that's the telegraph line he'll use to get his news out. At the pole, Scott found the tent that Amundsen had left. And in the tent were some furs that Amundsen didn't need and some other equipment. And the note for Scott to take the letter and mail it to the King of Norway. Scott still writes, it looks like the Norwegians were expecting worse weather, and it could scarcely be otherwise from Shackleton's overdrawn account. Scott is still having very good weather compared to what Shackleton faced. But the weather's about to turn on him. The drawing in the lower right is by Dr. Wilson, who was a physician, sort of, and a brilliant artist, a naturalist, and has sketched throughout his journals. Scott was puzzled by the note, but he did bring it back, and it was found with his remains. Near the tent, Amundsen's people had erected on a spare sledge runner a flag that marked the exact spot of the South Pole as near as they can determine it, and it had a little note attached to it. Well, when Scott saw it, he told Wilson to ski on over and see what it was, and Wilson yelled back and said, it's the South Pole, and there's a note from Amundsen that says this is the South Pole. And Scott said, pull it out of the snow. So they pulled out the South Pole, and they tied it to their sled to be used as a mast with a piece of canvas. When the wind blew from the right direction, it would help push the sled. So they pulled out the marker for the South Pole and tied it on their sled. Well, then they turned around and followed their tracks back, and the sled runner wasn't working real well as a mast. So they got to the place where they found that single black bamboo pole that first announced, Scott, you've been beaten. And Scott said, take that off the sled, take that pole instead and tie it to the sled. So they threw the marker for the South Pole down on the snow, pulled this thing out of the snow and tied it to their sled. And then he wrote, so that's the last of the Norwegians for the present. But wait, there's a lot more to this story that involves the Norwegians. Things start to go downhill, not only in terms of the weather, but also in terms of the way they're feeling. Feelings of despondency. They can't find their depots. They're pulling for food. They're short of fuel, which is the only way they can melt water, which is the only way they can get a drink. And they're beginning to run short on food as well. Petty Officer Evans, not to be confused with Lieutenant Evans, had fallen in a crevasse, banged his head, and he dies of a concussion. We'll talk a little bit about Scott's diet. These were his rations: a little bit of cocoa, a little bit of sugar, some tea, butter, a highly processed biscuit, which was virtually all carbohydrate, and pemmican, which was a combination of ground meat and animal fat. And this was their ration, about 33 ounces per day per man, if they were at full rations. When Shackleton came back from his trip, he wrote, if you're going to be pulling loads here, and if you're going to be going for the South Pole, you better be eating at least 40 ounces per day per man. Scott's already, in his planned ration, 15% below Shackleton's recommendation. There's something else about this diet, and that is there is no vitamin C. And this brings up the question of scurvy. Some of the symptoms, you see them listed here, depression, loss of appetite, bleeding gums, loose teeth a little bit later on, tachycardia, which is a racing heart, which is probably what happened to Shackleton in 1909 at their first expedition and the cause of his collapse. And scurvy is well known on expeditions. The medical literature from the Navy said that within 90 to 100 days, if there's no vitamin C, no lime juice, you can expect scurvy symptoms to show up. And this happens in British expedition after British expedition. Scott saw it with Shackleton and Wilson in 1902. Shackleton reported it. One of his men collapses, 33 miles from Ross Island on that expedition. They barely make it back alive after a rescue attempt. Lieutenant Evans, Crean, and Lashley, who left from Scott 150 miles from the pole, two of those men collapse 36 miles out, and this is where the novel starts. Well, February 1st is day 90 for Scott, but Scott isn't 50 or 60 miles from Ross Island. He's 500 miles from there. On Ross Island at Cape Evans, this man, Dr. Atkinson, who left from the top of the Beardmore Glacier with 3 men, is now back at Cape Evans, and he's in charge of the entire British expedition. He's a physician, and as a novelist, I would never dare to make this up. This is true. As a physician, his specialty, tropical parasitic diseases. So naturally, the Navy sent him to Antarctica. And now he's in charge of the whole mess. Some people are out with Scott on the barriers. Some people have left on the ship. And there's 13 men at Cape Evans looking at a lot of empty bunks. And Atkinson has several problems. I'm only going to talk about one tonight. But the main problem is there's no food or fuel left at One Ton Depot. Scott's plan had called for only enough food and fuel there for Lieutenant Evans's team to use, and then they would move further north to the next depot. So the depot behind them would be empty, and the men at Cape Evans were supposed to take the dog teams out to One Ton Depot and restock it so Scott and his people would have food and fuel to make it the rest of the way back. Well, Scott sent the dogs back 3 weeks late. So One Ton Depot hasn't been stocked yet. And Evans is faced with figuring out how to get food and fuel there. So they loaded up 2 sleds and they took 2 dog teams out there. And his instructions to Cherry Gerard, who drew this short straw and had to go there, was stay as long as you can at One Ton Depot, hoping to meet Scott's party, but don't overstay your rations. And so that's what Cherry Gerard does. And he's there between March 3rd and March 10th. So where's Scott? Well, on the 2nd, he's 120 miles away from One Ton Depot, and he writes that they found a shortage of oil. They're only doing 5.5 miles a day. His plan is that they have to do 9 miles a day or they overshoot their supplies. And things aren't looking good. Particularly, he writes about the fuel, that they don't have enough fuel. Yet in 1901, he had faced the same problem. His fuel cans leaked. They leaked then, and they're leaking now. He knew it then, and he knows it now. 4th through the 6th, we see a series of entries that begin to set the basis of conspiracy theories later. These conspiracy theories go on till today. Did Evans use more rations than he was allotted? Did the other teams going back spill more fuel than they should have or could have? What happened? The truest thing up here is that we got to do 9 miles a day or we're in deep trouble. And that's a 9 mile a day average. If they're stopped by bad weather, they have to obviously increase their mileage over the next few days, and they can't. Sometimes they're only making 6.5 miles. On this date, Scott notes that they can probably not make it to One Ton Depot. Captain Oates' feet are frozen. He keeps them outside of the sleeping bag at night, even though the temperatures are 35 below zero, because if they begin to thaw, they become excruciating and he screams. Same day, Amundsen pulled into Tasmania and sent a cable to his brother Leon in Norway saying, "Pole attained, please tell the king." But he keeps quiet about the main story for 3 days, and there's speculation as to whether he got there or not. Remember, Tasmania is in the Eastern time zone, and so there's a time delay to London. Well, London caught news of this, or wind of this, and all the news for Scott is controlled out of London. Not just the news in London, but the news in all the English-speaking papers that are part of the Central News Syndicate all over the world. And so they sent out fake news later that afternoon, the same date on the 7th. This is from the Wellington, New Zealand paper, one in Ottawa, Canada, and Salt Lake City. I just picked 3. And all of the news is the same. Amundsen says Scott reached the pole. And of course, it's not true, but it's got play in the papers for a couple of days. Finally, 2 days later on the 9th, the London Times kind of puts out the real news that Amundsen got the pole. They put it on page 8, along with a companion article that says, well, you know, Amundsen really didn't play fair. He shrouded his intentions. He deceived people by saying he was going to go for the North Pole. He went for the South Pole. And that's really a shame, for no one would have welcomed cooperation in the work of exploration in the South more than Captain Scott. And I hear by chuckles, people don't necessarily believe that. Well, Amundsen's story came out on the 10th, and he wrote it himself. If you ignore the headlines put in by newspaper editors, there was little adventurous about the trip. They would do 15 miles in a day. They'd, feed the dogs for a couple hours, take care of some equipment, sleep for 6 hours, get up and do it again. So they're doing 30, 35, 40 miles in a 24-hour period. And of real hardships in the way of food, there were none. Not the same for Scott. Oates is going downhill. Scott writes again one of his enigmatic entries about generosity and thoughtfulness not being abundant, and admits that the whole thing is a miserable fumble. On his birthday, Oates' feet are frozen. He crawls out of the tent and tells the others he's not coming back. He sacrifices himself, hoping that they can get a few more miles. By the end of the month, Scott is 158 miles from Cape Evans. He's 11 miles short of one-ton depot, and he writes, "The end cannot be far off. For God's sake, look after our people." But this isn't known in the rest of the world. His ship goes back to New Zealand, carrying the dispatches that Scott had written to within 150 miles of the pole. And now the news agent in New Zealand is the first one to be able to put all the pieces together. He knows when Amundsen got to the pole, and he knows where Scott was when he was 150 miles from the pole, and he knows it's not going to work out. The early expedition in their fundraising, it was quite clear that it was all about getting to the South Pole, right? And science was, something else. This is Scott, Kathleen Scott, and Sir Clement Markham, who was Scott's mentor and head of the Royal Geographical Society. And so on April 1st, he's interviewed by the Central News Syndicate, and he puts out a long article which says quite clearly, there was no race. No race to the pole. No question of a race. No race. We're there for science. Methink he doth protest too much. Or it's called spin control. Over the next 3 days, there are headlines and newspaper stories on page 1 of the newspapers talking about Scott's expedition, hairbreadth escapes, near-death adventures, finding new scientific specimens, everything but the race. Ponting is back in London, and he's giving presentations. He takes absolutely spectacular pictures, not only for the time, but for any time in Antarctica. I've been there. It's really hard to take pictures. And they're whimsical. And he's giving presentations and movie shows and so forth, but the revenues are 60% below what they had projected in terms of what they needed to pay off the expedition. His sponsors are happy. They've taken publicity pictures for Heinz baked beans and Frank Cook's canned rhubarb. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think I'd want to be in a hut in Antarctica for the winter with 31 men eating canned rhubarb and baked beans. That's probably a good idea. Well, the following summer, Atkinson pulled his people together, and they launched a recovery party to go back along the route of march to try to find Scott's remains, if they could. And 3 different journalists, they all agree in the fundamental story, that about a half a mile off to the right of their line of march, Silas Wright, who was a Canadian geologist, spotted something. And what he spotted was a bamboo flagpole painted black. And when they got there and dug down, it was tied to the sled, the last of the Norwegians. In the tent, they were surprised to find 3 bodies instead of 5. They read Scott's journals, which said, in Scott's handwriting, the finder of these journals may read the journals, but then seal them up and give them only to my widow. Something that didn't happen. But he also wrote a message to the public, and he did this very carefully in the last days before he died. And he writes, the causes of the disaster were not due to faulty organization, but to misfortune in all risks we had to undertake. The pony loss obliged me to start later than I had intended. I read this and I thought, whoa, wait a minute. The weather throughout was bad. Not quite true, and it wasn't unexpected, and neither were the snow conditions, but they were in the last message. And those events cut into our provision reserves. Every detail of our food and supplies and clothing and depots has been worked out to perfection. Remember that? You've written that earlier. And a shortage of fuel in our depots for which I cannot account. It went on to say, we would have returned in fine form, except that Petty Officer Evans fell in a crevasse and died. Our arrangements would have given us everything we needed, and they were adequate. No one could have expected these temperatures. And we would have gotten through anyway, except that Captain Oates died. These rough notes and our bodies must tell the tale. We're not quite done with the Norwegians. The recovery party led by Atkinson built this snow mound over Scott's grave. And Atkinson wanted to put a cross at the top, and he said, let's use Scott's skis. One of the members of the recovery party was a man named Trygve Gran, one of the younger members of the expedition. He was a 21-year-old Norwegian cross-country ski champion brought on board to help Scott's men learn how to ski. And Gran went over to Atkinson and said, let me take Scott's skis so that they may complete his journey. Instead, use my skis to make the cross. So Scott's grave is marked with a pair of Norwegian skis, and his skis completed the journey on the feet of a Norwegian. When they got back to Hut Point up on Observation Hill, they erected this cross with the words from Tennyson. The cross remains, and if you go to McMurdo Sound, people that go to McMurdo Station can still climb uphill. The cross is still there, and you can look out over the barrier to where Corner Camp used to be, and off into the distance to where One Ton Depot was. Terra Nova left shortly after they erected the cross. They got into New Zealand, and they had orders creep in the middle of the night. So they arrived in the harbor, having had no contact with other ships, at 2 a.m. in the morning. 2 men were loaded ashore. They were rowed ashore by one man and went back to the ship, and then the ship took off for the sea and was told, don't come back for 2 days. Atkinson was one of the men, and they were met by a press agent who then went off and telegraphed news about Scott and parts of the journals and the last message to London where the news was released. That's the same night that Amundsen was supposed to lecture at the Red Gym here in Madison on the campus. And he came to the station in West Washington and stepped off the train and was met by newspaper reporters holding up special editions. Scott and his men found dead. What do you think? And all he could say was, this is horrible, this is horrible. There must have been some mistake. Well, that night, Amundsen gave his lecture at the Red Gym. The Chicago Tribune helped cover that. It was one of the papers covering that event. They had estimated the crowd at 3,000 people. And Amundsen became one of the first world leaders and explorers to give tribute to Scott. And this is what he said. They put special trains on to move people from Stoughton and Mount Horeb into Madison, and they kept them on later so they could go back and forth. The next day, the papers all over the English-speaking world were filled with stories about Scott. The news syndicate had pre-positioned illustrations and pictures in the capitals where the newspapers were printed, and then cabled off elements of the story that they wanted to put in there. Among them was the entire message to the public. And this phrase is probably the most remembered from those articles. Had we lived, I should have had a tale of hardihood and endurance that would have stirred the hearts of every true Englishman. This comes from, whoops, wrong way. this bunch of stuff. That's from the actual journals. In some of his journal entries, he wrote in one direction, and then to save paper would turn it 90 degrees and write in the other. And that's what that translates into. 3 days later, there was a memorial service in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There were 2,000 official mourners, including the King of England, the royal family, all the members of Parliament, the Admiralty, General so-and-so, Lord and Lady thus and such. Most of the cast of Downton Abbey were there. And over 10,000 people outside. The London Times would write that this is the temper of the men who build empires. While it lives among us, we shall be capable of maintaining an empire. In the 1968 edition to the book that this library found for me, his son wrote, "It was, after all, the manner of their death that created the legend." And I think that's probably the truest words. These are some of the sources that I used and some of the sources of the images that you've seen tonight. For those of you that have purchased the book and brought it, I'd be glad to autograph those for you if you'd like. If you didn't like the book or you didn't like this presentation, don't throw the book. It weighs about 2 pounds. And for those of you that have it, it's available on Amazon, both as a paperback and now as an ebook. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd be glad to answer questions if I can. Thank you for listening to my story.